Today, it's Australia's Davros moment. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one latest post covering finance and property news. It's Friday afternoon, and Tarric has joined me for another chat. Tarric, welcome back. Nice to see you. Been so quiet these last couple of weeks. I don't think we've got anything at all to talk about today.
No, nothing at all. Just Trump tearing up the international order, and although I'm just in the last 40 minutes or so, apparently Andrew Huxley's people are hitting the phones for a bit of a discussion over who should be the future leader of the Australian Liberal Party. So that should be interesting.
Yes, and I've been following the Davos. And for those who don't know, Davros, of course, was the founder of the Daleks, and this very evil character who was basically shaping a whole universe and wanting to sort of push power in a particular direction. Never mind the rules, never mind humanity. Exterminate, right? And I'm thinking, well. Okay, at Davos, you've got all of these ultra-rich people who flew in on their private jets and have had this big bun fight this week. Trump came across. The Mark Carney speech, which for me was actually a very interesting speech, talking about the disruption that's being created and the world order sort of shifting. Although actually, my view is that the world order has always been dictated by the US. It's just that the gloves are off now, and it's just the screen has been moved, so you can see how it's actually working. Power's always been a bit like that, and of course, Carney was, as a central banker, very much in the mould of the existing world order. So that's quite interesting. And then locally, in Australia, of course, we've had the hate speech legislation this week, which has then catalysed the issue with regard to the conservative side of politics and how that's playing out, and all the defections, and all of those things are in play. And I have to say that I worry now. Can I call Jim Spin Jim, or is that hate speech?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't really want to test it in court, especially with the way things are. I mean, it's all very, very vague, and to be honest, that's nothing new for some of this sort of legislation in Australia. And I would have really loved to have been wrong on this one, that the conservative side of politics would have stood up and at least delayed this legislation. But they ended up just waving it through in the end. Well, part of them waved it through, and then the other part said either abstained or said no, and that's why we are where we are today. I mean, although technically speaking, someone made a very correct assertion the other day that now, if you count up all the seats that aren't held by the Liberal Party or Labor, they are now equal to the Liberal Party. So technically speaking, you could make an argument that if all the crossbench came together, they would now technically be the opposition and not the Liberal Party. So interesting. So we certainly live in interesting times.
Yeah, and it is worth highlighting that there have been a couple of occasions previously where the coalition has sort of fallen apart, and the Liberals got in, although they then had to form an official coalition after the election rather than before the election. But I do think the One Nation angle here is quite interesting, with the numbers in the polls there showing that there is definitely fluidity in the structure of politics in Australia. And I also would remind everybody that Albo came back with a huge majority last time, and it's probably likely that he'll get re-elected next time, almost whatever happens. I refer to Davros.
Well, it's an interesting one because I actually went through the polling recently at a sort of individual granular household level, and there was some really, really interesting insights in that, because right now we're seeing this big schism between the Liberals and the Nationals, and one of the big reasons of why that is occurring, at least in my view, is the Nationals are now being significantly outpolled in the bush by One Nation. In regional and rural areas, One Nation are now polling at 32% compared to the Liberals, the Liberal Nationals, only on 20%. So it's become existential very, very quickly for that element of the Liberal Party. Now, if you're an inner city, well, there's not that many inner city Liberals left, let's be honest. But if you are part of, the urban Liberal Party, One Nation's less of a threat. They're only, in the inner metro areas, they're only polling at about 12%. Whereas if you go out to the bush, it's all they're getting almost a third of the vote. So it's very much an existential threat for the National Party. So one really does wonder what happens from here. I mean, we've already seen Barnaby Joyce, the former Nationals leader and former Deputy Prime Minister, jump ship. There's speculation that he won't be the last. So, if things continue to perform poorly in the polls for the Liberals, then what happens next? Do we see a Nationals One Nation coalition? Do we see more Nationals peel off and take the party apparatus with them to One Nation, and they remain, they're no longer Nationals in name? So it's very much in flux at the moment, and it obviously all just depends on if the Liberal Party gets a new leader, how does that new leader perform? If all of a sudden, Albo continues to be on the nose and we see the coalition pick up a bit of steam in the polls and narrow the gap, then perhaps we won't see such a schism, but it just depends on what happens.
And this feels a bit to me like fiddling while Rome burns, right? Because out there's a real economy with real people trying to get by with inflation hotter, the jobs market looking a lot hotter than people expected, and the RBA due to meet, in early February, which suggests that, they might hold rates certainly, but even possibly put rates up. And we're already seeing fixed rate mortgages rising, and that's putting more pressure on households too. So I feel a bit like the old magician's trick, as I've spoken about before, the misdirection. Everyone's thinking and talking about all the political fighting and everything else, the infighting, but that's not really the main thing that I think people should be talking about. We should be looking about how ordinary Australians are doing, and many aren't doing very well.
Well, to sort of riff on your, fiddling as Rome burns, sort of motif, I kind of get the feeling that we've got most of Parliament in a big giant philharmonic orchestra, doing their bit. Or, I mean, perhaps, might be more apt to say that they're performing on on the stern of the Titanic in terms of, the way a lot of Australians are faring. Things are going down, but up the back here, we're well above the water. We're further above the water than we should be, so everything must be fine.
Oh yes, the band on the Titanic who continued to play as it plunged into the depths. That is a very apt analogy, Tarric. And it's sad to say, but it does seem to me that when I talk to ordinary people, and the things that worry them, and the financial pressures that many are under, they are getting more and more disconnected from the Canberra bubble and all the things that the mainstream speak about with regard to the political, upstarts in Canberra. There is another very important story, and you've spoken about the burnout economy and all those things previously. It's all playing out, unfortunately, in a very, very uncomfortable way for many people. And it's interesting, just looking recently at some of the distribution of wealth. Everyone's been blaming the baby boomers for the distribution of wealth, and the sort of the convolutions that we've got. Actually, it's the next generation down now that actually have the majority of the wealth, because more baby boomers are falling off the perch, and the next generation down is the one that's had that massive property bubble.
It is, and I think the thing is that that's going to be what's going to continue to happen, basically, just down the line. Because it's inevitable. You can't have one generation ruling the roost forever. We all, the end comes for us all. But I think the thing is that but what we're seeing over time is as time passes, you see a smaller and smaller number of people owning their own home. You see, a much more focused display of wealth. You see it more heavily concentrated in certain demographics. So for instance, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare has got a really good chart on this, that basically every single cohort to come after the elder boomers, which were people born between, I think it was 46 and 51, and then their analysis, has a worse rate of home ownership. And as you have shown in your data, which I believe you shared with the ABC last year, you're seeing more and more people in those older cohorts with mortgages. So while you do have this enormous transfer of wealth, it's generally from the wealthy to the wealthy, to their to you know to their children. So it's not actually, this sort of, there's this idea that, oh, one day Gen Y and Gen Z are going to be rich, and that's true. One day, as a generational block, when they get their turn, the same way that Gen X is getting now, they will be the wealthiest. But it's not going to be. It's going to be even less widespread than it is for Gen X. And not only that, but we're also seeing the government push back on things like aged care costs. And we're seeing the government wanting a larger and larger slice from people in order to, continue to back people in their old age. So it's gonna be a lot more messy and challenging than the sort of Gen Y and Gen Z to rule the roost headlines would suggest. And just to sort of quantify this a little bit, according to data from the Victorian government, the median inheritance is much closer to new Toyota Camry money than it is to I'm gonna pay off my house and it's totally life-changing money. So, once again, averages mask.
Oh dear, averages do indeed mask. And the other thing, of course, that I keep coming to as I think about the treasure earth, trying to find other sources of income to pay for the exorbitant amount of tax that's required to be able to actually pay for the big debt. And Chris Richardson highlighted the other day that the latest distortion, 47 point something billion of additional treasury spending because, well, costs went up that they didn't forecast were going to go up. That's nothing to do with new policies. That's just, for existing businesses. So that wealth transfer suggests that one day they may even look at, what many other countries do, which is to have effectively death taxes coming in so that some of that wealth goes to the state rather than to the next generation. So I'll be watching that space, Well, I wouldn't be surprised it's one of the few levers they've still got left.
Well, I think that for the time being, they're probably not gonna pull it because it is one of the things that I think could probably let the coalition back in the door at this stage, unless it were somehow bipartisan. But it's interesting that you mentioned the sort of fiscal sustainability thing. I decided to basically figure out what it would be like if the government pushed what I like to call the idiot button. What if they just decided to throw the kitchen sink at continuing to support the economy, basically infinitum?
Mm.
So what if they decided we're gonna run as government, so this is across state, local, and federal, we're gonna run a deficit of 6% every year forever until we run out of scope. What I found is that basically we could get towards the back end of the 2030s before we reached the same level of debt as say Canada has to GDP today. So there is a lot of scope for a whole heap of stupid, even if they take the worst possible option. So I think that's worth keeping in mind, going forward, that the constraints on the government in terms of spending are very much political. They're not economic at this stage. And I think that's really, that sort of, that's really the heart of burnout economics. It's what can they burn to keep the plate spinning? And we're seeing that, around the world. You're seeing it with Trump, you're seeing it in Europe. What can we burn in order to, I mean, you're even seeing it in Japan. They're talking about launching another stimulus package, despite the fact that they're the most indebted country on the face of the earth. So, well, the most indebted developed country on the face of the earth. There's some, iffy stuff there in terms. I mean, countries. I'm ruling out countries with active civil wars and that sort of thing in Africa, but yeah, it's just a mess, and there's very, very little appetite to actually address these core issues rather than just kicking the can down the road and leaving a bigger mess for the next generation. I mean, I thought that my generation was getting a raw deal. The next generation, if things keep going the way they're going, is going to get a much, much worse deal than we ever got.
Absolutely. Fiscal space, of course, is what we're talking about. And Australia does have still fiscal space. But of course, it costs because that means that we have to generate more income from taxes. And that's one of the reasons why taxes are so high at the moment. And the profligate spending, of course, is it's spent well, AUKUS. And, are we doing the things we should be doing to support society? Not necessarily. Just coming back to Trump and Davos, there's a very interesting conversation point. I don't know whether you caught this, but in his speech, and it was a very rambling speech on all sorts of things, there was a very interesting moment. I want to quote him. Every time you make it more affordable for someone to own a house cheaply, you're actually hurting the value of those houses. I don't want to do anything to hurt the value of their house. If I wanted to crush the housing market, I could do that so fast that people could buy houses, but you would destroy people who already have houses. There you go. So it's in black and white now. Of course, this is very much the same as the O'Neill doctrine for Australia.
I like that.
Yeah, but it does show you the problem, right? So effectively, they don't want to destroy the wealth for the existing, which means that their status quo will continue for quite some time.
I think it's rather funny that if you actually look at the numbers, so let's look at what Trump probably fears, right? Well, let's look at, say, like the U.S. housing crash, right? Depending on the data source in question, prices fell in the US by at an average level of somewhere between about 24 and 27%, right? So really, in the grand scheme of things, not an enormous amount. Like there have been much, much worse housing crashes elsewhere, say Japan, for instance, but it is enough, to sort of scare Trump. But I think the funny thing is that given how much prices have run up, given how much we've seen housing turnover collapse, and also the fact that housing turnover wasn't terribly robust even before the pandemic, I don't think that it would be that big of an imposition. I don't think it would trigger a financial crisis the way that the 2007, 2008 housing bubble and, GFC did. Like banks are a lot better regulated than they were. Credit was tighter than it was, and unless you see that cascade failure, you're not gonna have the same issues. And not only that, but it's also the fact that people leveraging into property as property investors is a lot less prevalent, because if you actually look at the underlying data, and in particular in terms of forced sales, there was a disproportionate number of property investors who got clobbered by the GFC, and in particular people who bought off the plan in markets which had a big run up in prices, places like Miami or Las Vegas, and that were highly sensitive to the economic conditions that followed. But even if you look at, but just to take it in an Australian direction for the moment, if you look at the numbers from the RBA in terms of their estimates for negative equity that they did back when housing prices were falling and everything was going in the right direction for a change, you're still talking about well under, I'd say well under about 6% or 7% of households being in negative equity, even if housing prices fell to the degree of the US housing crash. So it's really not that big of a deal. We're basically just going back to where negative equity was in about 2018, 2019, after we saw housing prices fall in parts of regional Queensland, regional WA, and Perth. So really, it's not that big of a deal, but the problem isn't actually a financial crisis that people fear. What Trump is worried about isn't that. He's worried about what impact that's going to have on the economy through the wealth effect, and what impact, by extension, that's going to have on the stock market and the wealth effect. Because that is really what's keeping the plate spinning at the moment, when you have a situation where the top 10% of Americans are basically doing very nearly half of all the consumption.
Absolutely. It is about the wealth effect and about keeping the engine running and the economy running for the benefit of, well, at least investors and the people who are actually coupled to the 1%. And I remind everybody, of course, that the diversity of experience between those more affluent people who are actually enjoying significant asset growth, whether it's gold or whether it's property, they're doing well, whereas actually there are a lot of people who have no such assets and no such good storyline, and they're hand to mouth. Even in the US, it's true that the real average income for ordinary people in the US are not rising. And it's a very much a case of again, averages mask. If you take the average, then things are not looking too bad. But of course, it's not equally distributed. Same in Australia, and that's the problem. And I think we come back fundamentally to the question about, well, who is the economy for, and for whom are politicians acting? And I think the obvious answer is the one that is probably it's not for you and it's not for me.
Well, I will say one thing that we've seen in recent years is that they're at the very least being more transparent about it. Like we do have Trump saying what he says about housing. We've got Claire O'Neill saying what she said. And I just think it's, we are seeing, the mask come away. And by the same token, we're not really holding politicians accountable for that when there's no real downside in what they're saying. And I think that's a big part of the problem that we have at the moment. Politicians are going to do exactly what they can get away with. That's that's always been the case. I mean, I'm sure, you can literally go back to some of the more extensive records of places like ancient Athens, and you can see the sort of crap that they tried to pull. Now, it ended badly for a lot of, well, not a lot of them, but it ended badly for a sizable proportion of them, ending up getting exiled and all that sorts of things. So I don't know. I mean, maybe we need to look to ancient Athens for some inspiration. Do right by us or get exiled. Lose all your property, lose all your lands, and bye.
Yes. Well, I always think of Aristotle and democracy and the fact that that there is a theory of the way that the state should work, and there's a practice the way the state actually works. And theory and practice, even in those days, didn't work that well, and it's still not working that well today.
No, and I think part of the problem is that we have an increasingly disengaged electorate, and this is something that you even see, with pollsters and academics and all that sort of stuff who look into this sort of thing. Just that, people, and not only that, but because these days in particular, we were already disengaged politically prior to the pandemic. But if you add in those extra layers of challenges of the cost of living, of higher interest rates, higher rents, the rental crisis more broadly, just achieving a roof over your head, it's very, very challenging to then focus on politics, on the minutiae of day-to-day governance, particularly when, government isn't even doing the big things right, let alone the little things. So I don't know. I can't help but look at some of the sort of older, I mean, I read these housing policy documents from, the 50s, an analysis on them from the 80s. And it's just striking just how focused they were on outcomes, on quantifiable things, being able to say, oh, look at what we achieved. Look at what we did. I mean, I read this interesting speech from Robert Menzies, I believe it was for the 1955 election. And he was talking about how many homes the Liberals, they had been built in the 5 years under the Liberals compared with the 5 years under Labor. And it was a competition on who could improve people's lives more, who could build more homes. And just interesting little tidbit. But if you adjust that into per capita terms, then translate it into today's population, guess what? We would have built 238,000 homes in the last 12 months, which is almost what we need to meet Anthony Albanese's housing accord.
Well, that's a very interesting observation. I don't know whether you saw it, but the ABC are running a series at the moment of things around black swans, and they actually covered the Elizabeth story, Elizabeth being a suburb of Adelaide. And Elizabeth was one of those suburbs that was built from scratch, and a lot of government support for housing. And it thrived and brought in a lot of industrial companies, and had a very good start. And in fact, there was a recording of the Queen, the previous Queen. I was going to say the ex-Queen, the previous Queen, visiting when she was there in the 60s, I think it was. But of course, then the industrial base got carved out; it fell away, and now Elizabeth is one of the the less nice places in and around Adelaide, with a lot of deprived areas there. And it shows you the power of government, if they put their mind to it and actually do things, how they can change the outcomes for ordinary people. But if they turn their backs on it, it all goes terribly wrong.
Yeah. And I think, yeah, exactly. And I think the thing is that what we've seen is that the likes of Chifley and Menzies and the leaders from that era put in such a great performance in terms of laying the groundwork for the future of Australia, in terms of building the infrastructure, building the housing, building, the hospitals, the schools, everything. And I think for a long time, we got away with, I mean, this continued to a degree, depending on your perspective on the issue, up until like the 80s.
Hmm.
If you look at, just say, for example, if you look at, say, public investment as a proportion of GDP, but after a while, it just fell away. We stopped investing in the future. And we basically rested on our laurels. We rested. I mean, if you're, say, for example, from Melbourne, like myself, those roads that you drive down every day, most of them were made prior to the 1980s. With the exception of a relative handful. If you're going out towards some of the newer suburbs, and we rested on our laurels because they had done such a good job. And not only that, but they arguably over-engineered Australia. We are still relying on, say, for example, the water infrastructure, of which the overwhelming majority was built before the 1980s. Yet we've grown the population inexorably since then, and it's still holding up okay enough as things stand today. So what we've basically seen is just government on autopilot. Things were just easy enough, and you'd have the demographic dividend. You had all these different things, all these winds at our back, that they could get away with it. And they thought that they could just keep taking the Howard approach. Oh, money will fall from the sky because of China. Demographics will be good, and that will help boost our revenue and cut our costs, and things will basically be that same way forever. And I don't think that any government post Howard has ever really confronted the challenges of the modern world in that regard. They just continued on the same path that Howard was always on. And you listen to the Liberals talk about things, and it's like they don't even acknowledge the severity of the challenges. I mean, you at least get perhaps some lip service from someone like Chalmers at times, but from the Liberals, you don't even get that. And then they look around and they go, well, why have we been turned into a giant blue political piñata? Because you're idiots. Because you're not paying attention to the right things. Read the foundational text of your party. Read The Forgotten People by Robert Menzies, and then come to the conclusion of what you need to focus on. There's a reason why the guy was in power for decades, and why the Liberal Party won election after election between 1949 and until they lost to Whitlam in the early 1970s.
Absolutely. Well, back then they had a bit of vision, and as you say, they over-engineered and built for the future rather than just trying to, get to the next election and get re-elected. They actually had an agenda about laying the foundations for the future. But we seem to have lost our way, unfortunately. Now, I guess we should move on to the next part of the show, Tarric, where you've very kindly put some slides together, and we just have to start with this rather, well, appropriate, I would say, cartoon.
Yes, it is. Well, I think Janet Yellen was always dreaming, but as usual, the charts will be available at burnouteconomics.com, where, just a little bit of self-promotion here. I'm running the first ever sale on subscriptions there, which are currently 20% off for the next week, because I recently, to celebrate hitting 40,000 followers on Twitter. Also, if you would like to support my work in another way, I'll get Martin to put a link to my YouTube channel in the description, where we will have some clips of today's show and other future DFA shows, and also some original content to come later this year. So without further delay, we'll get into the numbers. Now, last week we talked about the issue of what does government versus non-government GDP look like here in Australia, after a viral chart showed what it looked like in the UK. Now, last week we talked about what it looks like deflated by the ABS's deflators, which basically means the way the ABS adjusts different components of GDP, like government or like household spending, or any number, or public investment, or any number of other components, by very specific individual adjustments for the cost of living and the cost of inflation. But obviously, that then means that there's very, very different levels of inflation in X and very, very different levels of inflation in Y. So what I've done here is I've just applied a blanket level of deflating by inflation, and I've just used the regular everyday consumer price index that that we all know and tolerate. And what I've done here is I've taken GDP per capita as deflated by the working age population, and I've split it into two groups. One that is government. This is direct government, not otherwise, and non-government. And non-government spending has actually experienced a technical depression in per capita terms on this metric. And a technical depression, by some definitions in academia, is a 10% contraction. Meanwhile, government GDP per capita has risen by about 4%. So I think this just really illustrates just how reliant the Aussie economy has become on government to drive economic growth, even as things go south for basically everything else. And I will just quickly note that for those who are wondering what it looks like in terms of the regular ABS deflators, it's down by about 4% in per capita terms. I will send Martin a copy of the article that this is for when it goes live, and I go into far greater detail on all of this.
Yeah, very interesting, and it confirms what we thought about, which is that we know that the economy is absolutely on life support because of what the government is doing. And whilst they may have lip service of dialing back that, in reality, if they do, they'll be in recession, which means that they've only got one path at the moment, which is to keep pouring the money down the gurgler.
Indeed. And I think one of the interesting things is that even though we are seeing these improvements in things, say, like, for example, like household spending, if you look at the granular data, say, for example, from the Commonwealth Bank on their household spending data, once you break it down into per capita inflation adjusted terms, things get a whole lot less favorable. So, for example, they break their data down by per capita by working age population, and then they also look at it from, say, for example, housing tenure. So if you're a renter, your real spending is falling in per capita terms. If you own your own home outright, your spending is falling in per capita terms. So the only group of people by housing tenure who are growing their real per capita spending are mortgage holders. And well, that's a little bit problematic, isn't it? Because if the only thing driving that growth is the fact that we've seen lower rates and there was the expectation of further cuts, and we're now seeing that reversed, and also, and more than that, we're now also seeing the possibility of a rate hike as early as next month. Oh boy, that's not a great base to be building an economy on. But despite the fact that all these different things are so weak, because migration is high, and because migration is also very poorly targeted, and you're adding a lot more people who need various goods and services than the people who actually have the skills to provide those required goods and services, inflation is back. Inflation is an issue, and we're seeing this across parts of the rest of the world. So we've got a really big problem with a weak economy and rising inflation. I think there's a word for that.
Stagflation? Could it be? Could it be?
Oh, that sounds like hate speech, mate.
Oh, can't say that, can we? And I also make the point, by the way, that if you look at discretionary spending and non-discretionary spending, in other words, the stuff you have to buy versus the stuff that you aspire to buy, a lot of the growth has been in the stuff I've got to buy rather than the other stuff.
Well, therein lies the problem, isn't it? And I think, excuse me, and I think that's one of the big issues that we're going to have going forward, because we have this issue now with housing whereby renters are paying a larger proportion of their income toward housing than at any other time on record by some metrics, say, for example, the ones put together by Domain. And then on the other hand, you've got people who've experienced the largest relative rise in mortgage rates in the history of Australia who have now only seen a relative handful of cuts, one of the smallest rate cut cycles from this level in Australian history. And now there's the possibility of not only rates staying high, but going up. And it's just an absolute mess. And, the question then becomes, well, what happens next?
Mm.
And the answer, the unfortunate answer is, it's all up to Anthony Albanese, because that's who's driving the economy these days. It's not the private sector. It's Albo through government and the rest of government more broadly. And it's the fact it's how much are they going to be pulling the migration lever, because that is what's growing the economy. It's not growing for just the average Joe at home.
Well, I've got the view that because it's the only game in town, the migration story will continue to be one of growth, probably not very selective growth. And that puts more pressure on infrastructure, we said before, puts more pressure on house prices and rentals and all those things as well. But because it's the only game in town, they're going to continue to do it. And I guess it's also just worth sort of thinking about, so how does Australia stack up with some of the other countries around the place, because in theory, Australia was the place to come, and it was the place to enjoy massive, positive experiences. But some of the data suggests that may not be the case now.
No. Now, this from The Economist is absolutely fascinating. Now, I shared this chart a couple of years ago when The Economist first started producing this data series. Now, we've got here is 3 columns. On the left, we've got GDP per person at market exchange rates. So that's basically just per capita GDP, then converted to a common currency, which is usually the US dollar, and then calculated from there. Then in the next column, you've got GDP per person adjusted for purchasing power parity, which basically is a proxy for the cost of living in each individual nation, which then adjusts it for a fairer comparison in terms of currency. And then in the third column, we've got a chart which adjusts for both purchasing power parity, or PPP, and the number of hours you have to work to achieve that. So if you're looking at this particular chart, Australia in the first column comes 10th. You start adjusting for price differences for PPP, Australia comes 19th. And then you adjust for hours worked, Australia comes 20th in the world. So despite the fact that there's this idea that Australia is this amazing, advanced, and, hugely affluent economy, and don't get me wrong, to a degree that is true, but it's not this sort of podium or top 10 finish that people would think it is. And just one little interesting tidbit about this does not factor in the cost of buying housing. This factors in renting, and it's, deflates it by those various components, but it does not factor in the cost of buying an existing home. So if you were to potentially adjust for that, oh boy, it'd be a hell of a task to do. But somehow I think Australia is going to fall well outside the top 20 and then some.
Yes, and it is worth reflecting, I think, on this, Tarric, that of course other reports suggest that the average Australian is what's some of the most wealthy in the world. But when you actually strip that away, that's because our house prices have gone higher than a lot of other countries. And we've got this massive forced savings program into superannuation, which isn't really accessible for many people until an older age. So again, there's a bit of artificiality in this idea that somehow magically, the average Australian is one of the most affluent individuals or households in the world. There's another story, and this Economist chart really, I think, tells the story much more accurately.
It does, and I think the problem is that at the heart of Australia's issues, both economically and socially, is the idea of Australian exceptionalism. And don't get me wrong, I love Australia, and I think that we have done a lot of things well over the years, and I think we for the vast majority our history, I think that we've done really quite well. I mean, you could literally go back to 1901 and look at a chart of GDP per capita around the world, and Australia's up there. It's up the top. You go to 1950, we're up there. We're up the top. And, like, we have done remarkably well as a nation. But in more recent times, we haven't managed, or, well, our leaders haven't managed our nation well. We should be continuing to get ahead. We should be enjoying the fruits of our huge and natural resources. We should be, building a future to continue to take advantage of our mineral wealth, and for that mineral wealth to flow more directly to the benefit of the Australian people. Like, say for example, using a sovereign wealth fund, like what Norway has done. And look at that. They're up the top of the list. And that's without them spending the trillions and trillions of dollars that they have. So, well, it's not trillions and trillions. It's about, what, 1.5 trillion. But it's a whole heap of money for a country of 5 million people. But there just needs to be a better path there. And I think part of the problem as well is that we also just need government to acknowledge the reality of what sort of economy we are. We are not a diversified, advanced economy like the US or Germany, or even to some extent Britain. You know, but we're much less complex. So you'd think, okay, resources driven economy. You've got a limited amount of resources that you then need to spread the benefit of over a populace. You would think that then, like Qatar or Norway or whomever it may be, that you would then turn around and you would limit the level of growth in your population, so you didn't dilute the benefit of that, because then you could literally, in a lot of ways, just coast on your laurels. You've got this huge, big resource base that's going to keep producing, that's going to keep delivering in some capacity. You put the money away, you spend a little bit here, you spend a bit here and there, provide for people, so like the same way Norway does, and then everything works, everything's hunky-dory. But we haven't done that. We've gone for easy, unsophisticated growth of just more people, more people, more people, more people. Despite the fact that if we go back to last fortnight's show, the fact that they expected us to be in a much, much better position than we are here today, even though they expected much, much less population growth. So we're much, much worse off than we thought we'd be, even though we've got all these extra people. So it's just a mess, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And, if you think about the levers that need to be pulled, of course, one of them is housing, because, of course, a lot of people coming into the country means that we've actually got greater demand for the housing stock that we've got, whether that's in the rental sector or whether it's actually in the ownership sector. So it begs the question, well, what is the relativity in terms of our capacity to build, perhaps relative to other countries? And there's a bit of interesting data on that too, isn't there, Tarric?
There is indeed, my friend. Now, a lot of the time there is this discussion that, oh, well, what we need to do is we need to be more like the US. We need zoning more like the US. We need to be more like America. Blah, 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 infinitum. And don't get me wrong, there are some lessons there that I think would be good to learn, that I think that we could improve things, but it is not the silver bullet solution that it appears to be. So what I did is I went through about 40 years worth of dwelling completions data for the US, Canada, and then I went through by Australian state. I then chose the most poorly performing major state, which was New South Wales. The best performing state was Queensland, and if I was to redo this chart, well, it almost wouldn't be fair. Canada and the US would be smashed utterly into oblivion. And I mean oblivion. So our worst performing state at an average level outperforms both the US and Canada in terms of dwelling completions per capita. Yet instead of Australia having the cheap housing, the plentiful housing that you would associate with being, well, the strongest home builder in the Anglosphere of major nations by far, we instead have a housing shortage of, if you adjust for the demographic changes of households, as done by Shane Oliver, 300,000 homes. So our policymakers have managed to find a way to screw things up so badly that the best performing builder in the Anglosphere has a housing shortage. While Canada, which comes in second on today's little comparison, now doesn't, because it made the changes necessary to achieve that.
Yes, and we've reminded people before, I think, that the average time to build has blown out and the average cost to build has gone through the roof. And of course, there is now a almost record number of building and construction firms falling apart and going under. And yet we're still managing to build a relatively large proportion relative to some of these other countries. And I think that's just an interesting observation, but a concerning observation when, of course, everybody says, we need to build more, we need to build more. Well, actually, we're pushing the engines pretty hard.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I think what we need to do is we just need to be reasonable about this, really. I mean, if you've got a situation where you don't have enough of something, the answer isn't to ask a whole bunch more people over to then not have enough even more. I mean, you look even at even if you go by the government's own forecasts from the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, we have a deficit just from July 1st, 2023, of over 150,000 homes. And those are the government's own numbers. If you start getting into estimates from people, say like HIA, who estimate that we need 100 to 120,000 dwelling completions per year before we even welcome a single migrant, then obviously the estimate of the shortage rises significantly further. So we've just got this stupid approach from policymakers that just doesn't acknowledge the demand side of supply and demand economics, which is just the most foundational thing in the economic world.
Absolutely. Now, the consequences of this, of course, are widespread. It means that it's quite difficult for people to get somewhere to live. They're having to pay a lot more. And now the prospect of potentially interest rates going up rather than down from this point means a lot of mortgage holders are quite concerned. And that's reflected in the latest confidence numbers from the likes of Roy Morgan.
Indeed it is. Now, recently, with the release of this data, ANZ noted that this was the largest fall in consumer confidence since 2023. Consumer confidence got absolutely whacked. Now, the theory is that part of this is just the give back from the optimism that you always see at the start of every year. But ANZ believes that it is largely down to the changing landscape of interest rates and the possibility of further rate rises. Now, I'll also note that if you look at the sub-index of this particular index, which is the ANZ Roy Morgan Consumer Confidence Index, and you look at the outlook for the next 5 years, that is currently lower today, even on a rolling 4-week average, than it was during the absolute height of the panic during the pandemic. So I think this really just illustrates where Australians are at. There's this hunky-dory, greatest country in the world, and we're going to make it better narrative from Albo. But I think this really illustrates just how dire a lot of Australians are feeling about their current financial circumstances and the future of the economy. And it's not a pretty picture.
No, it is interesting because when you look at it, some of its component parts, one of the things that some of the surveys do is to talk about people's price expectations for property. And interestingly, it's still going up.
Yep. Well, I mean, I think the thing is that what we've seen at this stage is we've just seen confirmation of support forever for the property market. I mean, we've seen the level of stock on the market, well, basically more than half from some years back in the 2010s for this time of year. And the market has never been allowed to recover from the shock of the pandemic. Whereas you look at, say, the US or Canada, it's not like that. I mean, say for like in the US, for example, the estimated number of sellers outnumbers buyers by over 500,000. So you're seeing significant downward pressure on prices in places where there's a lot of stock on the market. And just more recently, I believe it was yesterday, the number of the US home sale numbers, the expectation was to be broadly flat. I think it was a bit, but the estimate was down by about 0.3%. Instead, it plummeted by almost 10%. So you can see the wheels turning in the US housing market towards being significantly weaker. But here in Australia, we've got the hammer down on migration, we've got the hammer down on government intervention, and it just seems like every couple of months there's something new designed to prop up the housing market.
So the O'Neill doctrine, to quote what I said earlier on, it's there in the headlights. It is the only lever in town.
It is, and I think the problem is that if you take migration and the wealth effect out of the equation. Now let's just do it based on the RBA's estimates of the wealth effect. You take the wealth effect and you take migration out of the equation, you're going to have a recession. Like based on those, if you just do it purely based on those numbers, recession guaranteed. So they don't want that. So instead, we just make everyone's lives worse. Well, not everyone. That's not entirely fair. Just a large majority of people.
Yeah, and it just shows you that there's something really quite uncomfortably indicated here. And if you actually ask a broader question about how people are feeling about the economy into the future, it's also pretty negative, isn't it? So again, there's a disconnect between people's expectations about where house prices are going and pretty much everything else. There's a dissonance there which I don't fully understand.
I guess at some point it's just lived experience. You think about things just from the perspective of an average person. You're not like, you or I or some of the viewers who read into this sort of stuff into a, to a sort of crazy level of depth. If you're just Joe average, you've in the last, call it 6 years, you've seen a pandemic that would, under any other circumstances, under more normal circumstances, without the over $500 billion in government and RBA intervention, crushed the housing market. And instead of the housing market getting crushed, it got boosted to the moon. Then, a couple of years later, you saw interest rates starts to rise. And not only did they rise, they rose by the largest relative amount in Australian history. And that, under any other circumstances, would have clobbered the housing market, and was in the process of clobbering the housing market until we started to see that intervention flow through to support the market. So if you're just Joe average, you've seen the two biggest threats to the housing market in your lifetime not only not smack the market lower, but in a lot of cases, particularly in the smaller capitals, drive prices to the absolute moon. So it does make sense from that perspective. I mean, to be honest, I'm going to do an entire article. It's probably going to end up being like at least 2,000 words long, but a whole article comparing Australia, Canada, and New Zealand as to why their prices got clobbered and ours didn't. And if you want to just sum it up in a little bit of a picture, just a single picture, you could just put up a picture of Anthony Albanese on the screen, because that's what it is. That has been what's delivered the market from falls. I mean, really, property investors should have a shrine to the bloke, because they have never had a better friend.
All hail the great Albo when it comes to the property sector. The story is, yeah, exactly, yes. Now, I guess there's also another interesting angle here. What about the footprint of voters and their housing status, and how does that play into this?
This is a really, really interesting one from several different perspectives. This is from Demos AU, and it basically breaks down who people are voting for based on their housing status. Now, in the most interesting point on this one for me is renters, because you're seeing renters absolutely exit the Liberal Party in large numbers. Where once they may have won 25, 30, 35% of renters, they're now winning 16% of renters. Whereas even the Greens now, their share with renters is also not looking as favorable as it has in some at some points in the past, where they're winning 17%. And the big one here is One Nation. One Nation is winning 20% of the renters' votes. Now, obviously, Labor is still doing very, very well on 30%, but it just goes to show that those people without homes are much more inclined to vote for One Nation than they have been historically. And there's just one really interesting little tidbit in this that I found going through all the various data points. If you look at people aged 18 to 34, only 12% of them are voting for One Nation. Now, 18 to 34 is obviously the largest cohort of renters of any age demographic. Yet, 20% of renters' votes are going to One Nation, which suggests to me, purely just based on the basic math of the thing, that a disproportionate number of renters over the age of 35, people who've missed the boat on home ownership, are now turning to One Nation as an alternative.
And that trend is likely to continue, right? Because the pressure on renters is continuing. The latest data that we saw from both Domain and real estate showed that there was still growth in the rental charges that people were getting. All my surveys are suggesting that there are a lot of annual increases now coming through as well, which of course aren't caught in the official numbers because those tend to be advertised rents rather than actually existing rents. And so we see that more households in the rental sector are still under pressure, 75% of all renters in my analysis from my surveys. Because they're so dissatisfied with how things are going, they're more likely to look for alternatives. And at the moment, well, the latest polls show that One Nation seems to be occupying an ever bigger share of mind.
Well, one of the big questions for me going forward is exactly where the ceiling is on One Nation support. Because at the last election, they got 6.4% of the vote. Now, depending on who you're talking to, they're polling it somewhere between about 18 and 23%, which is, they've gone from basically winning about 1 in 15 votes to now closer to 1 in 4 or 1 in 5. But I think the big question is going to be what exactly is going to happen with those younger demographics. They're already doing very, very well with the older demographics. In some polls they're polling, close to 30% amongst those older demos. So the question is, what happens with those young people? Because it used to be One Nation was in low single digits with 18 to 34s. People were like, no, not interested in Pauline Hanson, blah, 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 too much baggage, etc. Yet now they have 12% of that vote. Now, don't get me wrong, 12% isn't a lot, but it's a hell of a lot more than the 3 or 4 that they would have got previously. So the question is, if One Nation does start getting more airtime, which, let's be honest, if they keep polling like this, they will, can they then make inroads with those younger voters if they start focusing on issues like housing, on issues like the way immigration impacts housing and that sort of thing? Because that particular approach has been quite successful in securing the votes of youths in other nations.
Absolutely. Well, we will watch with interest. I do think there's a lot to play for. And bearing in mind that the next election is a little way out yet, there's still a shakedown opportunity. But I do think there's huge fluidity amongst voters and also a bit of frustration, as we said earlier on. Now, I suppose the other interesting observation, Tarric, is, we've got the housing engine. It's the really big one. It's the thing that everybody talks about. The other engine, of course, is our exports and China. And it's worth noting, of course, that China came out this last few days with a 5% growth over the last year. Well, that was their target, so of course they achieved it. But there's some really interesting stuff going on below the waterline when you start looking at the Chinese economy.
Absolutely. I mean, what the Chinese economy is at the moment, it's a story in a lot of ways of overcapacity, of building all this enormous levels of industrial capacity to build everything from solar panels to cars. And now they need to find a home for all that stuff. For example, China now has more capacity to build solar panels than there is demand in all the world. But then so they need to find a place for all these things. So one of the really interesting things in the last say 5 years has been the rise of the Chinese car, and this brings us to today's chart, and it's a really interesting one. This shows the exports of Chinese vehicles and cars going back to the start of the 2010s, and as you can see from the chart, from the start of about 2021, China's exports of cars went absolutely parabolic. China went from being one nation amongst about half a dozen other major car exporters in the world, nations like Japan, Mexico, Germany, South Korea, and the US, at being at the lower end of those compatriots, to now China exports, or China will export more cars in 2025 than the next two largest export nations combined. And it's also worth noting that in this, Australia is not immune. Recent data from VFAX show that in 2025, Chinese vehicles made up for over 250,000. So this is about 1 in 5 new cars on Australia's roads were Chinese. So they are very much taking over the automotive world.
Very interesting, Tarek. And of course, Mark Carney, Prime Minister of Canada, was over in China. And what was one of the agreements that they actually announced? More imports of cars from China to Canada. So this is the point. And that data that I mentioned with regard to Chinese GDP was really interesting. The exports from China to the US have dropped, but the exports to pretty much everybody else continues to rise. So actually, maybe China doesn't need the US trade links because they've got a lot of other stuff in other places. And a lot of it is being led, as you say, by electronics and by solar panels and by cars.
It's going to be really interesting because when it was just a case of China, making toys or textiles or something along those lines, governments really weren't too worried about losing those jobs overseas. They're like, oh well, it's low skilled manufacturing jobs. We're going to replace them with whatever, high tech manufacturing jobs. That's sort of the narrative that defined the 80s and the 90s. But what they're finding now is that China isn't coming for those jobs anymore. It's already taken all of them that it's going to take. But in terms of more sophisticated jobs, things like advanced, say for example, consumer durable goods or cars, things that are really the bread and butter for some of the biggest economies in Europe, places like Italy, France, Germany, etc., where once, excuse me, where where once these economies were supplying their wares to China, now it's the other way round. Now instead of selling a Mercedes in Germany, or selling a Bosch dishwasher, sorry, is selling a Mercedes in China, or selling a Bosch dishwasher in Shanghai, it's now selling a BYD in France. But one of the advanced, Chinese electric cars, or it's selling a very high-end luxury Chinese consumer good to a family in Italy. So these jobs that they once thought were untouchable, oh no, no, we are so good, they could not possibly compete with us. Well, yeah, they can, and they are. And not only that, but because this trend towards greater and greater and greater Chinese exports continues to play out, we're actually starting to see pushback. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, came out recently and basically said, we're going to have to start raising trade barriers. We're going to have to start implementing tariffs unless we can address the issue of Chinese imports cutting our lunch. And this is something that he's raised with the head of the European Union. So I think that while this is a fascinating, you know, data point, I think the bigger, broader picture is one of that this is going to trigger enormous trade tensions. It's going to trigger enormous domestic issues as well as we start seeing more and more Chinese cars hit the road in nations that have traditionally been served by their own domestic car industries. And it's going to cause all sorts of social and political problems. So it's really going to be interesting how that all balances out because on one hand, China has invested trillions of dollars in this capacity to for all these products, from cars to high-end electronics. But now they need to be able to get the exports to be able to service that debt, to be able to make those companies profitable. But by the same token, you've then got the base of consumers in places like Europe or Canada, for example, who then need to be able to protect their own domestic industries, and that's gonna get ugly, I think.
Well, that begs the question then, trade routes, doesn't it? It begs the question about, the restriction or not, and who's going to travel to where and how, and all of those things. And that takes us nicely into the discussion of Greenland, the the Arctic, and all of those things. And you've got a chart to start that conversation too.
Indeed. Now, the Trump obsession with Greenland has been making a lot of news and a lot of waves lately, and they seem to have come to some sort of agreement for now, at least. I mean, we'll see how that goes. But what this illustrates is basically just a very different profile of what the map of the world looks like for the Northern Hemisphere. And as you can see, as the climate shifts, we're seeing greater and greater numbers of shipping heading through the Arctic. So it makes a place like Greenland, which could be Grand Central for shipping heading across the Northern Hemisphere, depending on how things play out with the Arctic and the various ice formations, that it could be one of the most important routes in the world. And also, as you can see there, it's also vital to Russia. It's vital for Russian flows of Russian oil, Russian gas, but it's also vital to the Russian fleet and their movements out of places like Murmansk. And just from a slightly different perspective, Greenland is looking at things from this particular profile. Greenland is also a very, very handy place to have in terms of the flights of potential Russian missiles into the US because they need to fly over Greenland in quite a few different cases, depending on where the missile silos are.
Yeah, there was a very good chart. I might put it in here. That the Wall Street Journal published, which showed that pretty much all of the flights from those areas into the Americas would actually hit apogee over Greenland, which means they're actually most easily targeted at that point if they were intercontinental ballistic missiles, for example. So it shows you again the strategic importance of Greenland. And I think there's a lot more to play here because it does seem to me that whilst there has been this sort of agreement, quote unquote, when you actually listen to what people in Greenland have been saying, and also over in Denmark too, they don't seem to be that close to what the agreement might be. So I wonder whether people have walked back from the brink, realizing that this was going to actually create a huge issue with regards to NATO. How much of an agreement there really is. But I do think strategically it's a very important issue.
I think it's going to be really interesting just to see what happens in that regard, because realistically, it's not like the US hasn't had bases up the wazoo in Greenland before. They've had dozens and dozens of them, during the Cold War. And if they really wanted to, I doubt that there's going to be that much opposition from the Danes for them to do that. I mean, it's a huge boon to the economy to have people in there building these bases, to have people roaming about, etc. So I just think that in a lot of ways, this is. I mean, Trump has said it himself that it's about his psychology. It's about him securing the Americas. It's about the Dunroe Doctrine. Which is his riff on the 19th century doctrine of President Monroe, which is basically the Americas belong to the Americans and nobody else, and we want all the influence in that area. But yeah, it's gonna be fascinating to see what happens, because Trump just keeps putting his hand. He puts both his hands and his feet in his mouth. Let's be honest.
Now, you had one other chart on China, which we might just go to, because there's a debt intensity picture here, which I think is really fascinating. Bear in mind what we just said about the growth of exports and how that's playing out.
This is from the book The Great Rebalancing, which is a absolutely fascinating piece of kit. I'll put a link to the author's Twitter in the charts links below. But what this basically shows is how many dollars of government debt does it take in order to generate an additional dollar of GDP in China. And as you can see, if you go back to, say, for example, during the GFC, during 2007, 2009, you can see that it was getting up towards almost $4 of benefit in terms of GDP for each additional dollar of debt. Whereas today, it's around about 50 cents in the dollar in terms of the return. So you're paying $1 of debt to get 50 cents worth of extra economic activity. So that's a really, really problematic thing. And just briefly, this is a substantial issue for Australia in particular, because Australia was the one who provided, say, for example, for the steel, the overwhelming majority of the imported iron ore that China needed to engage in that great debt binge that we saw, say, for example, during the GFC and its immediate aftermath, where China went on this enormous infrastructure building spree. And it made sense then, because for every dollar that they put in, they were getting multiples back in terms of GDP. So why wouldn't you? It's a great idea. But now, obviously, that's reversed, and it completely changes the business case for that sort of stimulus, because you are seeing those diminishing returns. However, that being said, my feeling is that if things get bad enough in China this year, which they may, particularly if we start seeing those trade barriers being raised, I think that it's well and truly possible that they could go back to the bad old days, and that they could engage in quite a debt binge, even if it is on very much diminishing returns, just to keep the plate spinning.
Yes, plate spinning is, of course, what the art of government seems to be about these days. Never mind whether you're actually being productive or not in the process. Of course, the other thing is the demographic shift in China is accelerating. So, in fact, the population is decreasing rather than increasing, I think, at the moment, which means that they are more and more dependent on finding those overseas markets and getting their manufactured goods out there into the national markets. Because, of course, China has become effectively the great manufacturing center for the world. And if you think about the whole shift here, and where we were in this world order thing, where effectively everybody said, yeah, we should have lots of free trade, and that's good, and everybody wins from it, to the point now where we've got these big power blocks, where you've got the US very firmly saying, no, we want to control this whole geographic domain through the Monroe Doctrine, and also, of course, call the shots, because we are the biggest militarily speaking, although China's catching up. You've got China, this huge block that is effectively the manufacturer of the world, now looking to find new ways to actually put its goods out there. You've got the Russian connection, which, of course, is very much a law unto itself, but also asserting much more influence directly or indirectly into parts of Europe. And so you've got these big power blocks, these big power plays. And going back to how's the world changed, according to Carney, yes, we're actually in this disruption. What we've really got are these power blocks now, and this multi-order, multipolar disruption going on. Everybody's sort of shuffling around and trying to work out how to make play. And it means that middle economies like Australia, well, they're becoming more and more bit part players in all of this. And I think there's a really important point here, is that the global world order, which was always very much under the doctrine of what the US wanted, is up for grabs now. And I think that Carney speech, for me at least, really spells out the jeopardy that there is for middle power countries, including Australia. And if we don't have a clear sighted view of our foreign policy, not just being America's poodle, but a much more clear sighted view, I think we're going to actually find ourselves in some grief ahead.
I think that we've got some fundamental issues, yeah, in this world at the moment, because I think the problem for a country like Australia, or even for a lot of countries in Europe, some of which are relatively similar to Australia in terms of the size of their economies, but the issue is, how do you how do you take policy from here? Now, there's this idea that everyone should cozy up with China, that they respect the international order, and all this other, to be completely honest with you, nonsense. That I mean, to be completely honest with you, if you do that, you're just going to allow China to just crush your economies over the next decade in terms of their exports of manufactured goods. So good luck with that and the social issues that come with it. But people need to make a choice with eyes open of exactly who they're going to back in this new world, and what exactly that is going to cost them. Now, I know that there's these ideas that, oh, it's okay, we just need to get through Trump and then everything's going to go back to normal. And there was that very much that feeling under the first Trump term, that oh well, once Trump's gone, everything with China will go back to normal. There won't be any more tariffs. There won't be this. There won't be that. And that wasn't true. America, American policy had become more hawkish, regardless. And I think the reality is that by the time Trump is done, if he serves out his full term, the damage is going to be done. Things would have been irrevocably changed anyway. So, but by the same token, then Europeans and Australians can't just think, oh, we'll just wait Trump out. We'll give it 3 years. Things will go back to normal. Everything we can go back to basically. Let's be honest. As Australians, we've been playing both sides for the last 30 years. We've been relying on America's security umbrella while we've been, feeding the economy of their most, I would probably say, America's most serious rival in its history. So we need to turn around and we need to make a decision, eyes open. What exactly? Who are we siding with? Why? What does that future look like? And not just this frankly idiotic approach of just Trump is mean, ergo we side with China. It's just dumb. Like, you don't make a forever decision based on one guy being a bit of a dickhead. I just think that we just need to be adults about this. But I think part of the problem is that the political class doesn't like being treated the way they've been treated by Trump. They don't like having crap talked about, and they don't like having their failures pointed out. And don't get me wrong, parts of Trump's criticism are absolutely on point. He's entirely correct, but the way he goes about it is like a bull in a china shop.
Well, it's the art of the deal, isn't it? I mean, we saw that this week with Greenland, pushing as far, and then coming back, and then people capitulating to a point where he still wins. So that tends to be the way that the art of the deal works. And I would remind you of there was a Lord Palmerston quote, Prime Minister in the UK in the 1800s, making the point that actually you couldn't have long-term relationships with other players because things shift. You have your own interests, and you have to be able to actually deal with your own interests and make effectively pragmatic decisions as you go forward, which means that your relationships that are firm at one point in history may not be firm at another point of history. That's just the way things are, because effectively you have to look after your own interests first. And I think that's a really interesting observation. And the question is, are those in charge of Australia looking after our interests in Australia, or are they actually kowtowing to other powers to try and protect trade relationships or defense relationships or whatever? And are those decisions in the interests of people in the country? And I think that's a big question, but it's an important question.
Honestly, looking around the world, I don't think there's only a relative handful of leaders who I think are capable of safely navigating these challenging times, these very different waters than what they're used to. Like, you need to be pragmatic. You need to know how to play different personalities. You need to know what your nation's relative places in the world, what leverage you have, and then how to execute that to the best of your national interest. I think that there are, I mean, I can probably you can probably count the number of leaders who fit that bill on one hand, and I think the problem going forward for, say, for a place like Australia is we do not have the political nous, the leadership, and I'm not just saying this about Anthony Albanese. Don't get me wrong, he's not up to the task, but neither is Susan Ley,
Hmm.
and we get to see anything from her potential successors, Taylor and Hastie, in terms of them being able to execute the that particular balancing act. And then, even you look at places like Europe, which is, the relative home of the developed world, just in terms of the number of developed countries, because there's dozens of them there. Um, they have the problem in that you may have someone, say, like Maloney, who is far more capable of dealing with Trump and the realities of things than others, but she's not the one who ultimately gets to call the shots. She calls the shots for Italy within the relative confines of Italy's bilateral relationships. But it's Ursula and the big dogs at the EU who are gonna be the ones who ultimately make all the big decisions. So, I just see an absolute fustercluck on the road ahead because a lot of these people are just completely not capable of dealing with these times. It's a little bit like what we talked about earlier, people just resting on their nation's laurels for decades and decades. So, you never really had to forge someone of capability to be able to deal with it. In a lot of ways, it's like looking at, say, for example, like a peacetime navy, a navy I mean, a good example is the 19th century Royal Navy. The that was more concerned about obeying orders to the letter of the orders and worrying about how much coal dust and blast dust they got from the guns on their ships, rather than actually being proficient in fighting a war. And I mean, there's the story of Admiral Tryon, who tried to teach people how to think for themselves and how to not follow orders that are literally suicidal. And, well, they ended up following his suicidal orders to his demise and his death. So, and I feel like we're in a little bit of a position like that. You've got a couple of Admiral Tryons out there, but most people are just so inexperienced with the realities of these situations. They just don't know what to do.
No, it's complicated. I know a lot of speed, of course, is communication, all those things, social media are all part of it. But yeah, I agree. I'm not sure that many of the people in leadership positions are really up to the job. I'd also beg the question as to whether the AUKUS thing makes any sense at all now. Giving us what? Well, maybe submarines, maybe in the future, for a huge amount of dollars that we're having to pay now. And bearing in mind what we've talked about, the relationships internationally, it doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense. I think that probably at the time people thought, well, if we pay that amount to the US, they will always protect us. Question mark. I think that what we've seen recently. So again, it comes back down to the capacity of our leaders to make good decisions for the ordinary Australians in all of this. And well, I'm just not holding my breath.
I think the thing is that Australia will be defended by the US because it's in the interest of the US. We are a big, giant, floating, unsinkable aircraft carrier for the US military in all of this. Pretty much the same way that Japan is, just a lot further away. And once upon a time, if you go back, say for example to like the 80s, the Americans had other options. They had the Philippines. They had in theater places where they could project power from that had, an established American presence. Whereas if you look at the Pacific at this stage, everything is still very much in flux. The US is doing better with its relations with the Philippines, and things are moving back towards that direction that they were in, sort of in the 70s and 80s. But it really the linchpins of American defense strategy in the Pacific, at end to end are, you've got Guam in the middle, you've got Japan up north, and then you've got Australia in the south. And that's what you're basically reliant upon. Because, okay, there are, say, for example, the US very often docks its ships in Singapore. But I don't think that unless, you see some rather serious seismic shifts, that the Singaporeans are going to be the ones to, you know, provide safe harbor for American ships in the middle of a war. that's something that's very much an open question. So they're very much reliant upon places like Australia and Japan, for their defense strategy. So in that way, we do have a degree of leverage. But then by the same token, they have leverage over us in the sense that that we rely on, the Fed to bail us out through the back end when things get challenging.
We live in interesting times, Tarric, I must say. And as always, I've appreciated your exploration of some of these issues today. I'm sure we'll do it again. I'm sure there'll be more to talk about because, well, things are moving at lightning speed at the moment. But really appreciate all the charts. We'll put all the links and things below. And, well, we'll catch you next time.
Well, thanks for having me, Martin. It's been great. And see you all later.
Cheers.